Good afternoon. My name is Kurt Schiller. I do content marketing here at Arcweb Technologies, and I'm going to be moderating our webinar today about digital product strategy and how to turn business ideas into well-scoped and build-ready products. We are going to be joined today by two members of the Arcweb team. That's Len Damico, our head of design, and Colin McCloskey, our head of engineering. And I'll let them introduce themselves in just a moment when we get to the actual panel. But before we begin, I wanted to give some real quick background on Arcweb for anyone who's not familiar. We are a premier digital transformation partner based in Philadelphia that creates custom enterprise software and impactful, engaging digital products and experiences. We've worked with over 100 companies to complete more than 200 projects and have been the recipient of multiple industry awards just in the last year, winning 2 Fast Company Awards and a Davy Award. And really what we do spans end to end of the product development process, from very early product and project strategy through the actual build and design of products, and then into the long-term maintenance and support and ongoing upkeep of them. And as I mentioned, today we are going to be joined by 2 members of the Arcweb team, Len Damico, our head of design, and Colin McCloskey, our head of engineering. And one of the things we'll be talking a bit more today about is just how integrally linked the design and engineering process is here at Arcweb when we are doing product design and build. And so it seemed only appropriate to get the 2 of them together to have this conversation. So before we get started, Len and Colin, do you mind real quick introducing yourselves, maybe starting with Len?
Sure thing. Thanks, Kurt. As you mentioned, I'm Len Damico. I'm the head of design at Arcweb Technologies. And I just realized that tomorrow will be 8 years that I've been with the company. So that's pretty cool. Yeah, and I lead our design team. We are often engaged early in an engagement, and our general task early on in an engagement is to help figure out what it is that we're trying to build, right? What is the problem we're trying to solve? And working closely with members of Colin's team to make sure that all the solutions that we propose are buildable.
That's excellent. I'm Colin McCloskey. I'm the head of engineering at Arcweb. I'm Len's counterpart on the engineering side. So I manage our team of engineers. A lot of my job is finding the right fit skill-wise from the members we have on our engineering team for the project needs or the client needs that we have engaged. And adjacent to that, I also set our consulting long-term technology strategy. I administer what we call our foundation. We try to keep our pulse on the technologies that are available in the marketplace and make sure we're set up for the right support for those on our future projects. And then I also participate in business development. So a lot of the things that we'll talk about today about building proposals, finding the right fit for a project is a big part of what I do.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Len and Colin. Before we actually get started with the discussion, I just wanted to mention, if you have any questions for Len or Colin or myself during our discussion and throughout the webinar, feel free to just drop them in the chat. You can either select to send it to everyone, or you can send it specifically to the host and panelists. We will either answer those in the course of our discussion if it seems easy to fit into where we are, or we'll also have a designated period at the end for Q&A. So also feel free to kind of hold those for the end. But if something occurs to you while we're discussing, or if you have a question about something you might want more detail about, feel free to drop it in the chat, and we will try to get to it. So I thought that a good place to begin this discussion might be to ask the 2 of you, Len and Colin, what is it that we actually mean when we say a product or a project, as the case may be? Because I think something that we've found in our client work is that there's a big difference between thinking that you want to build a product and actually being ready to build one. And a lot of what we handle in these early discussions with our clients is kind of trying to ascertain where people are in that process and get them kind of within our process and prepared to start engaging with us. And a lot of that process, I think, is probably very, very helpful and educational, whether you're working with a partner like us or whether you are doing it completely internally. So Len, since your team is often the first one at the table, could you tell us a little bit about some of what those essential elements are that we're going to be working with clients to hammer out?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Kurt. I think one of the first things you'll want to think about is, understanding, what is the problem you're facing, right? A product is really just kind of like a wrapper around a solution for a problem in a lot of cases. So identifying clearly and crisply, what is it that you want to be different in the world at the end of this product development process? So that means you understand your problem well, you understand it in terms of how you want to solve it and how you don't want to solve it. You understand for whom you're solving it, which is really key. You understand how they're kind of working around it not being solved today, like what existing systems are in place at their use that you could either improve upon or use as anti-patterns, basically. And then understanding what resources are available to bring to bear, whether that be calendar time, the time of talented individuals in your organization or partners, or financial resources that you can bring to bear to solve this problem. And additionally, one that often gets forgotten, but I think is really key, is identifying who the project sponsor is. Who is the person who's going to care the most about this problem being solved in an appropriate fashion?
Do you have anything to add to that, Colin?
I think Len hit it on the head when it comes to kind of setting the ground rules for how you're going to kind of engage in building a product. It's important that you know who decision makers are. And we know this in our work, but I know that other organizations have this problem where you don't know the answers to all those questions. You don't know who the stakeholder that's most engaged in the user experience or the other stakeholders at the table. You don't know who they all are, even when you're the client a lot of times. So a big part of the early game, I think, is figuring out who, in addition to what you think you want to build, who is going to have a say in what that is. We'll talk about it a little bit more, but it's easy to remember that you have end users and you kind of have the buyer, the client that's putting together a project. But often forgotten are the other stakeholders. So I think about IT managers, I think about security professionals, or the accountant who somehow holds down 3 roles in the company who's going to be responsible for auditing this thing at some point. So uncovering those things is an early part of the process that's important as well.
So moving along to really, I guess, what we would talk about of actually beginning development, some of the first steps in product development really start with taking that initial idea and refining it towards something that is actually buildable. So let's talk about that. How do you go from that kind of very lightly defined business idea into something that's actually that well-defined problem that you were talking about, Len? Like, what are some of the steps or the activities? I know that you guys both have kind of like a somewhat defined process that your teams move through to help clients through that actual process.
Sure, yeah. One of my favorite things to do is to just start diving in and start talking to the people for whom we've defined that this is a problem, right? I'm talking about things like user research, where we're going to be able to interview them, ask them questions, like not lead them along a path, but like help understand what's their world like. And one of the best tools to do that is a technique we call contextual inquiry, which is really just a fancy word for saying, I sit next to you and I watch you do your job. And I identify gaps, I identify spots where you're frustrated, I identify opportunities for improvement. So we like to start by doing a lot of that initial user research. That then kind of informs what we'll call some co-design workshops, some design studio type things, where we will bring a number of different stakeholders together in a room or via a virtual situation akin to this one. And we'll start hashing out the solution. There are a number of different techniques we can go about to do that. We'll do things like post-ups, where we're asking everybody to throw out ideas for features that would exist in their ideal solution to a problem, throw them up on the wall. Then we can do some what's called affinity mapping, which means grouping like with like. We can vote or anti-vote on some of those solutions, things that we should or shouldn't focus on. We can put them in matrices to understand how valuable those potential features would be and how difficult they might be to build. And the most important thing about these workshops is that they are cross-functional, right? They are not simply designers talking at business people on the product side. I want to have potential end users of the product there. I want the people who are going to be responsible for administering it. I want product leaders in there. And most importantly, well, not most importantly, but extremely importantly, I want folks who are going to be part of the engineering effort to build it in there.
Yeah, I think that's well said, Len. One of the things that we've realized in a lot of our experience with this is that everyone that you just named is also really capable of coming up with ideas. So the main core idea is one thing that normally that we all know what that is, or at least the people moving something forward early on know what that is. But a lot of things that are nuanced, or a lot of things that are details, come out from the individual stakeholders. One of the things that we like to do early on when we're working on projects like this too is make sure that someone from my team is engaged in those conversations as well. And they kind of get to be the no person, early on. Their idea is to essentially put rails on all these discussions that might get a little bit crazy, to essentially say and keep in mind what can be constructed, within the budget that we know we have, or the timeline that we know we have, or within the realms of reason. So it's not uncommon for us to be in a room with someone who's like, I want to build Uber for cartoon characters, or whatever it is, and there's an idea there that we can ground. So I think having engineering involved early, probably taking a back seat in terms of not speaking out loud, but listening and getting a sense of those things is important. And I think that that's important for all the idea generation reasons that I just listed, but also the keeping a sense of what was important in the initial goings. Early on, this idea, this baby that someone has, this idea of what I want to build and what problem I think it solves is important. And I think we can all acknowledge that by the time the thing is built, it will have gone through a number of shifts. But it's important that the folks who are going to be a part of that process remember what the initial target was and the initial stakeholders are as well.
So let me put this question to two of you. You mentioned a scenario where maybe you've identified what you think are key needs, and maybe somebody from the engineering side is doing like a reality check on the actual ability to build these things. How do you referee between opposing interests in this early process where you're still trying to figure out what exactly the product is? Like who does that and how?
I think that really comes down to the collaborative experience that you have with the people. It depends on the personalities, in the room. I've definitely been in meetings where the representatives from the client who have this idea strongly believe X, Y, and Z about that thing, and it's really important to make sure that you do everything you can to kind of get a design that gets X, Y, and Z covered. But I think removing egos is important. So you're talking about refereeing. Ideally, there won't necessarily be a need to referee, because part of this process is that you're starting already to prioritize, what's important. And you can't do that unless you can start to get to some quorum and some agreement about, this feature is important to me and this one's important to you. Let's try and figure out where we can put them in place. Len, I don't know. I don't recall many times where I've had engineering folks that are anti the design folks. It's more about a misunderstanding from, I think, engineering folks tend to not necessarily know what's a difficult design problem, and designers tend to not always know what's a difficult engineering problem. So figuring those things out and putting all the cards on the table is important early on.
It's key. Another thing that's key there is trust, right? I need to be able to trust you to say, or I as a design lead need to be able to trust someone on the engineering side to say, you're not just saying this is a difficult problem, it actually is a difficult problem. And the flip side of that, like we have to find a place there. You can't hide the complexity. You have to put it somewhere. You're either putting it on the designer to bake through, you're putting it on engineering to abstract away, or you're putting it on the user to figure out while they're actually using the product. So that's one of the, in terms of talking about how do we avoid or how do we referee those problems, I think you often avoid them, Kurt, by we're just constantly reminding everybody why we're here. We're here to build something awesome, to solve this problem for this group of people. We all want the same thing. It's not about, design flexing with a cool solution or engineering taking this into a needlessly complicated place. We're all trying to do the same thing here. And as long as we keep remembering that, keep coming back to that, those problems tend to sort themselves out.
So spinning off of that, if it's so essential to have all those different needs represented at the table when you're beginning this process, how do you actually identify everyone that needs to be at the table? You mentioned some ones that sound like they're going to be common to pretty much any product of, users, engineering, design. But I think, like, especially in a complex industry, for instance, where there might be multiple levels of subject matter experts, how do you go about identifying who those stakeholders are and then making sure that they actually are engaged at this part of the process?
I think from the times Len and I are today talking a lot about, being on the consultant side, the folks who are going to build the thing for you or help you come with that idea. The times in my life when I've been on the other side of the equation, where I've been the buyer or the client or the one with the idea, I think it's been important to, have confidence in myself as a subject matter expert, or know who I'm trying to serve. So when I think about client organizations we've worked with here at Arcweb that have been successful, and prior in my career, that sort of knowledge of whose life this thing is going to make better is there already. So those people are the ones that have to be identified. And I think that's a critical piece. And you can't have always the whole room of all of your end users in place, but there are definitely probably people that administer that effort right now, or manage that effort right now, whose life is made more complicated because the solution does not exist yet. So it shouldn't be, it's not always trivial, but it shouldn't be difficult to find out who the important idea holders are, or opinion holders are. Not everyone is adept at being in that room. Not everyone wants to be in that room, though. So I think finding that thing, that flow is important. As consultants, at Arcweb, we do that process where we try and make sure that we have early conversations that talk a lot about the ideas, they talk a lot about the goals, and they don't immediately start talking about, well, that means we're going to build this, this, and this. Mm-hmm. Eventually, someone's writing notes, so we can, the third or fourth meeting, we can say clearly we're going to build this, this, and this, and those are the pieces, and here are the unknowns. But early on, it's still about the solution and the problem, and who's got the pain points, and who's someone who can really contribute ideas to this part.
Len, was there anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I don't think so. I think Colin touched on it masterfully. He's an expert at rooting out those hidden stakeholders.
All right. Well, in that case, I'll kind of throw the next one towards Colin as well. So we've talked a lot about Len's side of the table, about kind of the design process and the design rituals almost that you might want to go through. But we've also mentioned about how important it is to have engineering involved in this early process. So what are some of those key engineering activities and contributions, and even like assets that should be being worked on even at this early stage of the game?
It's a great question. I think it's one of those things where Len and I are familiar with this, and our project managers are familiar with this too. The solution ends up fitting in kind of 4 boxes, of which you generally pick 3 of them all the time. It'll have a software solution is going to have an API and a front end, and it's going to integrate with this service. So a lot of the main ideas, when we're having these early conversations, it's about figuring out what part of a solution fits in which of these boxes that we need to have. Yeah, it's a good switch on the visual there, Kurt, because you can start to see the idea of an architecture diagram. So someone from my team whose title would be software or solution architect, they're senior software professionals. They're generally sitting in these meetings, somewhat contributing, but also just kind of trying to be a sponge of as much as possible of what are the data structures that this thing's going to have, what are the needs that this thing might have in terms of capacity, and that will start to dictate a lot of those engineering features. So I think if this is done well, the design process is a design process with what we would call a capital D design. It's not just a designer drawing ideas, it's a designer truly thinking about the user experience and working with the stakeholders on what the things that you're going to be able to hold that are tangible will be. And the engineering resources are in that place trying to figure those things out and start to draw the dotted lines between, in order to deliver that user experience, I'm going to need a caching system, or I'm going to need some sort of data pipeline that I'm going to have to build and do all those sorts of things. So I think engineering done really well is very, very quiet early on. And its main job is to make sure that we don't accidentally jump off over a cliff, without a parachute. With a parachute is fine. Without a parachute is not fine. And then later, we're going to get to a point where a lot of the work that the design lead and folks on Len's team, and even some of the original solution thinkers on the client, they'll they'll fade away. It'll be the people who are in charge of running the project. So your project manager, your engineering builders. Those are things that if we've done our good work in the beginning, taking notes, making sure we know where we need to land, that going through the main core parts of the project and the actual building can be done efficiently. I'm probably walking into a couple of different categories of conversation, but I like to think of the engineering members' roles early on as kind of being the guardrails, making sure that the idea is grounded. You don't want to be a wet blanket. You really want to contribute to, consider yourself facilitating idea thinking, but you sort of have to be a wet blanket sometimes in terms of grounding some decision making. And then eventually the decisions start to become more technical, and they're less about the user experience and they're more about efficiency or timeline or capabilities or open-endedness. So the early on, Kurt, I think the engineer's role is to be there, be an advisor, and be a sponge, as much as possible. And then later on, they're going to deploy their skills to build the thing.
Mm-hmm.
One of the key things that takes place there that Colin started alluding to is this idea of the interaction between the user experience lead or the user experience architect and the software architect. And it surprises people a lot of the times when they witness a well-oiled process for the first time to see how much interaction and iteration on both those sides takes place in terms of the software architect will throw a data model up on the wall, and the user experience architect will beat it up and say, well, what about this? And similarly, as a UX lead is walking through a prototype, and the software architect is saying, well, you didn't account for this edge case. So knowing and understanding that there's going to be a lot of back and forth there and a lot of iteration, and all of the thinking and all of the assets are going to continue to mature over time as we work towards understanding what you're building. That's a real key concept to keep in the back of your mind, because I think people are expecting this big reveal up front, and that's just fundamentally not how this works. It's all about iteration and collaboration.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's I think that's the most important part to what I've seen be our most successful projects is the UX lead and the engineering lead being able to be a resource for each other, challenge each other in a way that facilitates the construction of the best product. So I think I use the phrase fade away. Certain people early on throw a lot of ideas at the wall, and those are all useful ideas. They start to be part of everything, and they do fade away. And then they're here for the delivery, and hopefully they're very happy at the end. But I think this interplay between design team and engineering team, it's really who's doing the lion's share of the stuff you see changes, but everyone is invested, throughout that process, so they can be tapped as a resource. It's as a consulting organization, we do a lot of interesting work. So people on Len's team have to split focus a lot more than people on my team, but we kind of let churn on one project. But both bidirectionally, we make sure that those resources are tappable, weeks after, the kickoff conversations and their early design conversations, because there's always a new question that comes up or a new wrinkle that comes up. So it's outside the scope of this webinar, but a conversation about what that feedback loop looks like and what that interaction looks like is something that's certainly worth talking about when you're sprinting on a project.
So kind of moving on to something that definitely comes from our viewpoint as the consultants is I know that one of the biggest wishes I've heard expressed is, we'll start talking with someone and we'll go, wow, we wish that they had started talking to us, 6 months ago. Of course, we're going to say that because we're consultants, so we always want to be working with them. But I think there's definitely like a level of there's a big level of sincerity to that. Most of that is from a sincere wish to actually improve the product. And it's probably something to be learned from that about when should you start looking for partners, and kind of what is the risk basically of waiting until you think that you have a fully scoped out product before you start talking to someone like Arcweb, for instance.
Yeah, I was literally last week in a conversation where the gist of the conversation was, well, we can't find a partner to build this thing until we figure it out what it is that we want to build. And, I hear similar versions of that often, but really, I just want to reinforce that the figuring out of what it is that you're trying to build is arguably the most valuable part of the process, because there's so much variability. There's so many different ways to approach a particular problem solved. So many ways to, bring creativity and skill and craft to bear in terms of, getting a lot for whatever resources or time or staff you have available to solve a problem. So I'm constantly repeating that to, normalize the idea that you don't just have to have a 35-page PRD typed out and hand across the table and say a product requirement document. Just hand off to someone and say, all right, how much would it cost to build this? It's almost, you're not going to be happy with what you get because it's consuming somebody else's thinking, consuming somebody else's work. I just can't stress enough how important it is to have the team that's building the solution be part of figuring out what the solution is.
Yeah, I think it's important to know that the right partner, I think one of the reasons that happens a lot, Len, is because someone has a vision or they're still crafting their vision, and you get very protective of things like this. This is my idea. This is a solution that's really near and dear to my heart. And I think as humans, we've all had that experience where someone comes along and tramples that idea or tells you that you were wrong in these 6 ways, so you've got to rebuild it the way that we've got to build it the way I say. So a capable partner, and there are many, Arcweb is one of them, but there are many out there, wants to craft that vision and then help you make that vision better, not trample it. So I think I've used phrases so far today like grounding and putting the rails on and not being a wet blanket. Those are very different approaches than essentially trampling something or trying to churn something out as quickly as possible. So all of this said, there are different places to get a partner and bring a partner in. I think if you really don't know what the problem is that you want to solve, or you really can't quantify or qualify what some of the pain points are, it may be too early in the process. But once you started to realize that there are significant pain points here, or I could see a solution that might make this sort of ish that I'm dealing with better, it might be the right time then to engage a partner who can help you build up or realize what, let's say, a software-based solution to that could be, in ways you didn't even know that were possible. Len and I are both, technology professionals, and we privately chat a lot about how we didn't know that you could build an app this way or do certain things, that way with an app. So I know that everyone else out there has that similar thing. We think about our worldview about what we think is possible, and that's just one slice of things. So bringing a partner in early does help you expand that view of what's possible as a solution.
And frankly, I'm sorry, Craig, one final point to follow up on something Colin said. Yeah, a good partner early on will help you. You've got this idea, you've got this problem that you're trying to solve, and you have this idea that you want to go about to solve it, and you're protective of it, as Colin said. A good partner can help you validate that idea, right? A good partner can help you realize, yes, you are on the right track. Or a good partner can remind you, I'm sorry, C-suite person, you are actually not your user. And you're looking at this problem from the business's perspective, but your users have X, Y, and Z additional problems that your solution isn't accounting for. And a good partner early on can help you gracefully come to that understanding.
You actually said almost exactly what I was going to mention, which is that it's you are bringing more partners to the table. I think that a lot of times when people think about working with an outside partner on product development, they're thinking about it like I have made the blueprint and now I am giving it to the machine that builds the thing that I have the plan for. I hope the plan is good enough. But what you're really looking for is to add extra people to the process and the table that you have already begun, that you already have going. And there should be, assuming that you pick the right partner and that they're on the right wavelength with you, there should be a feedback loop that includes them, it includes you. It's effectively one big team. It's not just okay, I have the thing, I'm giving it to them, and I'll see what comes back.
Right. Kurt, that dovetails really well with what we were talking about earlier too. We a few moments ago we were talking about the design process and then the building process, and making sure that you're collaborating, so you kind of have this mesh rather than this fence you throw things over. That can be really useful at this kind of kernel of an idea phase as well. Every time there's a stop and a handoff, or I think that everything is 100% set and I'm going to give it to you, you risk losing the vision that you have for it or compromising what the idea could be. So I think, we would encourage folks, just like we encourage ourselves in the transition from what's the design of the thing we're going to make to actually making the thing, the idea phase can bleed into forming the idea thing. And that's really, I think, the heart of what Len was getting at, in terms of how you can be effective early.
And so I was going to ask about that, because I know that I've heard the two of you say, we don't want to just throw this over the wall. But in the past, what is, to kind of underline that, what is the consequence of just throwing things over the wall?
I think that the main challenge that you'll run into is just a disjointed build process. It'll be, without knowing that engineering fully understands the intent of the design, and I mean both the software architecture and the UX and visual design. There's no real reason to expect the outcome to be what you expect it if engineering doesn't fully understand and buy into the design of the solution itself. I personally, I have a sixth sense when I hear people saying throw over the wall. Like, the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It's not good for me. I even don't love handoff, because there's this implication that you're a relay race runner with a baton, and I've handed it to the next runner, and now I just kind of pull up and hope they do a great job. I like to think of it much more as a handshake, where you're much closer to someone. There's a lot more stuff being translated than just passing a hard physical baton. And the idea is there that the handoff is, or that handshake is just another thing that helps cement and build that relationship between the authors of the solution and the people who are going to bring it to life.
Yeah, I think that's a really good metaphor instead of handoff or anything like that. I think if you think about the way that you would map out these ideas, the concern of, I have 61 bullet points to develop this product, and I'm going to give them to you in a list, that can work. And if things all go according to plan, that will work fairly well, and you could throw it over the wall. But what I think we've seen, and what we all know more realistically, is that bullet point 32 is going to actually raise 16 questions, about what this really means. And if you've jettisoned the team that helped build that bulleted list early on, or you don't have access to them, you can't get confirmation on these things that become nuanced or they become unique. What I've seen, I think we've all seen a number of times, is that someone building a product has their own idea. They kind of want to protect their team from it, but then once it starts to get built and there's early demos, they want to start bringing other members of their team in to see, hey, it looks like this company is getting close to building the thing. Is it close to what you hoped it would be? And then that person who wasn't part of the process early on has 14 ideas, of which 8 of them now are super important. If we did a handoff, getting back to getting that set, if we just threw it over the fence, it's impossible. It's not. It's fair in a way. And Len used the word disjointed, I think, which is, I think, perfect. If it's more collaborative and it's something where the team stays engaged, every one of those things has the opportunity to become a product revolutionizing or product changing, benefit.
You touched on an interesting thing there too, Colin, is that the idea of, tossing it over the wall, and then people start to hear the commotion from when it thuds, and walking over and taking a look and seeing what's all the noise there, and wondering, it's just another that will raise people's guards when it comes to change. You're building this new solution for the way I handle my spreadsheets that I've been doing for 7 years. And I think that's one of the really important, we talked earlier about who we want to have in the room, and, a co-design process rather than me standing up there and telling you what this new solution is going to be. And to combat that idea of the disdain of change, one of the things we've noticed is that when you do design with those users who's are going to end up using your solution rather than for them, rather than designing at them, they often take a pride in their role in the process. They're really proud to say, I was part of the solution that crafted this. I was part of this. They're so much more likely to use it, and use it, quote, correctly, because they had a role in creating it. And they're more likely to, when new users are onboarded, they're much more likely to evangelize it and say, here's how we did this. I was part of creating this. Let me show you how cool it is. And, at the end of the day, this isn't ever our charge really, but they just feel more valued as members of an organization, because they were asked how this should go rather than told how it should go.
Len, I think that works really well more often for the things that are good, but it actually also helps with things that are wrinkles. And so I talked about people on my team trying to not be a wet blanket, but maybe realistically sometimes they are. But if folks are involved in that process of that complication arising and the way it's decided that it's worked out, people start to understand. Listen, this part is a little bit hard or kludgy, but there's reasons, and I understand it, and I kind of take that with the good things too. Because if we're talking about enterprise level or large scale software systems, it's hard to get every part of it working flawlessly, exactly as you want, because time and budget start to eat away at some priorities. Folks that are involved understand how the decisions that they love and the decisions that they don't love got made.
So I know we've talked kind of a lot about how this is somewhat of an open-ended strategic process, but I think for a last question, before we get to any Q&A that people might have. So let's assume that you've gone through this process that we just talked about. What are some of the indicators that you are ready to arrive at a decision point, or that you have actually successfully scoped out this product, that you have gone, as the title of the webinar says, from an idea to something that is actually buildable? Like what are some of the things that you should have in your hand, or that a partner should be developing for you? What are some of what should you have defined? And then what comes next? Like, what are the possible outcomes of this process? Because I assume that it's more than just, well, we build the thing.
I mean, a lot of it is sometimes that we'll build the thing, but I think a lot of what we've been talking about here is making sure that we have a plan that is one that can be a living, breathing plan in a regard. People need to know, now that when we started, we knew what the solution we wanted to solve, we knew what the pain points were, and we knew where we thought we were going. As we're about to we were talking about not handing off, but let's say we're transitioning from the ideas phase to the starting to build this thing phase. We should know where we're headed, and that might include a detailed set of features. We would call that a backlog, an idea of, in order to achieve these 6 user experiences, we need to do these 80 discrete engineering tasks. That list needs to start to get into a world where everyone who's in those rooms that we're talking about agrees that it's in the right order. What are the ones that are the most important to be included, and what are the ones that are a little bit less important to be included? All of those things, Kurt, help us get to and start to, as the partners, recommend how many folks are necessary to build this thing, recommend how long we think it may take to build this thing. But early on, we can kind of put our finger to the wind and guess, and we're pretty close, just due to experience. But going through this process helps you get really close, helping someone discover whether or not it's a 6-month project or a multi-year, endeavor that you've got to break up. A lot of those things become decision points that can lead you right into building the product, as you said, or build the thing, as you said, Kurt, or consider other options, which might include slicing down your scope slightly, expanding your scope based on some things you discovered, using alternatives. So I think a good partner at this point is going to be really honest with you about, yes, we need to move forward with a really excellent custom solution that we have all crafted, or, hey, this percentage of what we want to solve is solved by this off-the-shelf mechanism that's available to you. And what's a way forward where you can incorporate those things with everyone's interests in mind?
It's really hard to consider the idea of telling someone, hey, all this, these weeks of discovery work that we've just done, doesn't actually make sense to go ahead and build something. But that's really a totally viable solution and outcome sometimes, because if you're just going to ignore those sunk costs and throw good time and money after bad because, well, we discovered something, so we have to go ahead and build it, you're really going to end up in a very wasteful place.
And in terms of like additional discrete assets, is there anything like visual or design specific that you should be expecting that kind of goes alongside with the buildable features feature list?
What, the buildable list of features is not attractive or exciting enough for you, Kurt?
There are a lot of we could deliverable you to death over here on the design side, but I think there are 2 huge ones that just happen all the time and end up providing the most value, and those would be the user flow and the clickable prototype. a user flow ends up being kind of like a map of the territory from a visual perspective, right? This is understanding, once I understand all the different problems that I'm seeking to solve for my users, this is their map of how they go from point A to point to point B to point C to point F, whatever path they go down to solve those problems. And it seeks to understand what we call the happy path, and then the divergent cases. What happens if their file upload is too big? What happens if their connection flakes in the middle of trying to go through our process? So like really thinking through all those different edge cases. And that's, again, another one of those cases we're working hand in hand with engineering lead on early on to generate that is so key. And the other really big deliverable on the side is the clickable prototype. And the tooling's made this a lot easier over the past several years. We use a tool called Figma, but there are others. But we don't ever just work in flat prototypes, because they're meaning one screen and then one screen without having some level of interactivity in there. Because until you start to wire up a prototype and click through from point A to point B to point C, you don't really understand how the flow is going to go. You don't understand, does this feel right? Does this feel natural? You can't just, print out a bunch of wireframes on artboard and look at them on the wall and say, yeah, I got this. We understand how this is going to work. You absolutely have to have something that's interactive that you can move through.
Yeah, Len, that piece plays a lot of roles because it's really attractive for folks. One of the things we haven't talked about yet today is how do you get buy-in from, say, your senior leadership when you want to have this idea? Senior leadership tends to like clickable prototypes, and they can start to feel something tangible. But I can think from my side in particular, years ago, I was the software architect on a project. And one of our super talented software architects was the lead on it. And we were working on building a mobile application that essentially allowed you to activate devices. So imagine the handoff and networking associated with scanning, all that scanning QR code stuff we've probably all done in some part. And because of limitations on the device we were trying to activate or the network that we had to talk to get the code, we had put together a prototype and then knew that we wanted it to just be kind of A, B, C, D. And then realize things like, well, wait, if they've scanned this type of product, which this thing also lets them activate, you've got to ask them 3 more questions, and do all those things. So the prototype, better than anything, helped reveal issues, places where we needed to move decisions. And if I recall in vague detail, we had to move a decision that we thought would be like 6th to being 2nd, in that particular project, so we could get you through a process that made sense. So the prototype plays a lot of ends, and it becomes a tool for my team, not just part of what we have here as an asset.
So that really brings me to the end of kind of what we had planned out to discuss today. Before we go to the Q&A, in case anyone has any questions, do either of you have any kind of final thoughts to cap off the discussion? And feel free to say no.
I would just seek to reiterate the value of designing, as you're thinking about designing your solution, design it with the end users, not for them, and design it with the people who are going to help you build it rather than throwing it over the wall. Those would be the 2 things I hope someone took away from this.
And I think that the piece that I would add to that, which we talked about a little bit earlier too, is making sure that as much as is possible, those efforts are cross-functional. Members of every one of these kind of stakeholder groups, on the client side, on your kind of predictive end users, if you're building a new product or a new entry into the market, and the people who are going to build it at different regards. Everyone has, I think, really, really important inputs. And if you make those processes cross-functional, it gives you an opportunity to suss out those values.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Len and Colin. Well, that kind of brings us to the Q&A phase. We ran a little bit long, but if anyone has any particular questions, feel free to drop them into the chat window now. We will see them and we can try to address them. Alternately, if nobody has anything, we can always end a couple minutes early.
I would imagine that we have done such a bang-up job that all questions are answered.
All right, well, I don't see anybody typing, and there haven't been any questions so far, so I think you must be correct, Colin. We have done such a bang-up job all possible aspects of early product strategy have been addressed. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. This is actually the first in what is going to be a series of webinars kind of running through different phases of the life cycle of product development. So we're probably going to get more in depth on architecture and technology decisions, maybe some additional design elements and processes, things like the actual go-to-market and build and launch process. So we're going to be posting a recording of this webinar, which you will all receive in your email inboxes tomorrow. Thank you everyone for joining us. Keep an eye out for the next phase of this webinar series, and I hope you have a great day. So thanks everyone. Thanks Len and Colin, and have a good one.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks everybody. Take care.